Hello. Welcome to Seeking Heaven, the Near Death Experience and Other Phenomena. I'm your host, Tamara Calder Richardson, as well as a six-time near death experiencer, evidential medium, and Christ channeler. And welcome to my channel. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe to make sure you don't miss any episodes because I have amazing topics and guests. And it is such a fun, intriguing, and enlightening spiritual talk show. So tell your friends, share, like, make comments, and consider being a channel member, which really helps support this channel, and I appreciate it very much. So today we're going to do part two. So if you missed part one, which is where we are talking about, I have guests Jana Anna as well as Suzanne Munson, and we're talking about how they met, about writing the book. Jana Anna's a channeler, and she channeled the book, The Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson. But then we have Suzanne Munson, who we're going to have today on the show. Is going to talk more about this. She actually took that information, wrote the book, as well as she is a historian and how that happened. She also wrote another book. So let me tell you a little bit about Suzanne Munson before we bring her on, because we're going to talk about some of the secrets, some of the information that came through from Thomas Jefferson. Yes, one of our founding fathers, what he actually thought about certain topics today and what's going on. And that, I mean, that should be absolutely fascinating. And we're going to actually hear some of the things that he said. So, a little bit about Suzanne Munson, who's here with us today. She is a historian, and she has written a couple of books, which I will show in just a minute. She has written the first book, The Jefferson's Godfather, and is the biography about the founding father, George Wythe, the signer of the Declaration of Independence, and he was a mentor to Thomas Jefferson. And then the channel book that she wrote with Jana Anna, the information that was channeled and put that together and wrote it, is called The Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson. And that's about his commentaries about today and government and what is going on, which sounds so fascinating from him. In the spirit world, yes, consciousness does go on. Suzanne has lectured as the Wythe Jefferson Legacy at the University of Virginia, William and Mary, Virginia Tech, University of Richmond, continuing education affiliates, and she and many others. I'm just going to let her, she can continue on. And she also holds an undergraduate degree, and she is she attended the University of Maryland, master's degree in education, and Virginia Commonwealth. She's also attending the executive program at Darton School of Business at the University of Virginia. And she is, which I love this, she's very involved, executive director. She used to, her last place she worked was the Historic Garden Week in Virginia. So she's very much so involved in Virginia and the history. And she's even going to talk about some of her past life in Virginia. Her interest and her ancestors come all the way back from 17th century Jamestown area. So, and she also has memory and recall in that. So we're going to talk a little bit about that too. So let me bring her on. Suzanne, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah. Okay. So the past life. Wow, that's big. Maybe we'll go a little smaller. Whoa. Okay, here we go. So tell us, I mean, you've done so much for us, the history and Richmond. You have a true love for the Virginia area. How did that happen before we get into your books? How did it happen with the past life, and did you just start having recall, or did you get a past life regression?
Past life regression. I've had a couple of past life regression sessions more recently, but they were not part of my books, my two books that I did.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
But it did help. I mean, that's interesting. Yes, you're a historian, you have family from the Virginia, Jamestown area, but the fact that you had past life regression and you had some of this in there too, right? From your
Right. Yeah. In my first book, I'll talk about that. Actually, that came through the medium Jana Anna when I was working on my first book, which was about, as you said, Thomas Jefferson's wonderful mentor, George Wythe. And I wrote that book. This is the cover of it, Jefferson's Godfather, the Man Behind the Man. And the lower part of the cover says mentor to the founding fathers.
Okay.
And I read a book about Wythe's death. He was poisoned by a bad nephew looking for early inheritance. And he was the only signer of the Declaration of Independence to be murdered. That's his claim to fame today. But he was greatly instrumental in getting America off to the right start by teaching our future leaders, 200 leaders who not only understood government after they had been with him, but they understood that they had to operate as public officials ethically. They had to become ethical public servants, not just run for office, but do
Yes.
it for the sake of serving the people. That was primary, and he instilled that in the future cadre of leaders after the founding fathers, that next generation. And he did a lot of other things. He was instrumental in saving the Constitution from oblivion during its ratification rounds, and very helpful to George Washington during the Revolution. He was Washington's personal attorney. Anyway, he had a wonderful, exciting, interesting story that was lost to this generation. And so when I read about him, I thought, well, why don't we know about this man today? I mean, he has so
Right.
many lessons to tell us about the ethical foundations of good government. We need that today.
Right.
And so at the time when I read this book about his life and death, I was working and I did not have time to write a book. But as soon as I got the idea that I wanted to retire, immediately I said, I can write this book now. And it became my obsession for a number of years.
Wow.
Anyway, so I spent a lot of time writing that book. And after a while, and so my two books, if you put them side by
Yeah.
side, the first one is a work of serious traditional history, Jefferson's Godfather. I only used this one, I only used the same resources that other historians use, and that's physical evidence, letters, reports, anything that came down from that period that's in writing. I did not deviate from that. I did have some insights from my medium toward the end of the book that were interesting, and I did insert a few things with said, make sure you put in there that we're all in this together. Um,
Oh, wow. Really?
yeah,
That's
and I did put
powerful.
that in there because that was
Wow.
obviously a belief that he had. He was a great humanitarian. So then so the first book is straight history, traditional history using traditional resources. The second book, which is the Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson, is what may be a new genre today. Um, I may be breaking some new ground. I'm probably not the first, but I think I'm the first to do a figure like, certainly first for Thomas Jefferson.
Mhm.
Uh, Writing a book that includes channeling from an historic figure. And I was told in a reading with the medium Jana Anna that my people on the other side were seeing me as a metaphysical historian. And
Yeah.
I wrote that down because I write down everything that comes through in the channeling, and put it in a file and didn't think too much about it. And then, as I had said earlier in the session, I had another session with Jana, and then the reading that came through for me personally, I was seen as a scribe, as a person bringing important things from the past to the present. So that was the genesis for my book, second book, Metaphysical History, and that is history from spirit.
So this is, I mean, this is really groundbreaking because I can tell you, I am a medium and a channeler. I live in that world, and I was, we had Jana Anna on in the part one. Amazing how they talked about how they met, how her evolution as a medium and her surrendering to God and the universe and all of that, and how this whole book came about. It was very fascinating how they came together. So you've got to see part one is to really give the backup on this. But the fact that you're a historian, you are able to validate a lot of the information coming through, right? That she mentioned, and then also she made it clear in the part one, Jana, that, which I totally get this, when she was channeling and giving the information, she doesn't remember what she said. Later on, she was like, Wow, that's really good. Who said that? You did. Okay. What? Which she was talking for Thomas Jefferson, and I do understand. People don't understand when you're channeling. You just have no clue what you're saying. You just surrender and trust in God. You're working with the highest God and all that. It's all good, but you
Right.
don't remember at the time. So, were you able to substantiate a lot of the information in some way? I mean, this is so experimental and groundbreaking and exciting, and it's also lets people know that it doesn't keep history in the past. First of all, it makes you look at history differently because this figure is still aware, still conscious, and still communicating. But it makes us also own and look at our history a little bit different, and what does that really mean? And also to know that the people before us, they're watching this whole scenario with us as humanity.
Yes, he's very current on current events. Well, in the second book, the Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson, the book is divided into subject areas. Government is very, very important to me. That's why I organized the book. I don't say wrote it because I didn't write it. I was the scribe for it, not the author. Mr. Jefferson was the author. But the first chapter is about government. We talked about the military, the media, religion, higher education, and a number of topics that would be foreign policy that are of current interest. I knew, so each chapter, I begin with what I know about Jefferson, the historic Jefferson. And I knew enough about him from writing the first book that I could write an introduction to each chapter: Jefferson on government, Jefferson on religion, Jefferson on freedom, Jefferson on slavery. There's a pretty good chapter on slavery there because that's really the focus of a lot of people's attention right now in Thomas Jefferson. And that was a very interesting exchange. So I knew enough about Jefferson so that if anything was coming through, you were asking about validation, it all sounded extremely plausible that he would say these things. And no, he didn't say, go to Monticello and look under a tree and I've buried treasure under there. There wasn't anything like verifiable like that, like some people have in a channeling experience. But it was all a higher thought. His thoughts about good government, what the founding fathers left for us, things like that. He did come through on all of those things.
So, do you want to share some of the? I know we've got several things here that you did want to read a couple of things that he wrote. We've got different topics: government, religion, the media, military, foreign policy, higher education, like some of the things you're talking about, and actually the forming of the Declaration. I mean, I would love to know some of his thoughts because he and several other men, uh, I'm sure, worked tirelessly to be able to have the Declaration of Independence and the also the Constitution. And I mean, you're the historian, and government is your heart center. I mean, do we still have the Constitution? Does it? I mean, or does it still apply? I mean, where have things gone off the rails? Uh, you or Thomas Jefferson are welcome to answer.
Well, he says very clearly that people need to go back and read these documents, the founding documents. And in my book, The Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson, at the end, I do include the Declaration of Independence because he says people need to go back and read his thoughts there. His thoughts were not original to him. Some of them were, but he was really echoing John Locke, who was an Enlightenment philosopher. But nevertheless, it's timeless wisdom. All men are created equal, and that we have the right of self-government and so on. Yeah, he said definitely we need to go back and certainly study the Constitution, certainly study the founding documents. He said that the founding fathers had left good building blocks for our government, and they were mostly assembled when he had left. But then he said they'd been reassembled over the years. And the government is not serving all the purposes it was intended to serve. Of course, Jefferson was for a limited federal government. He was more for the states having more power, simply because he was such an advocate of freedom. And he thought if you diffuse the power, people would be safer in smaller units. But he said that a lot of that has changed now, that the states are an extension of the federal government, and that they had been infected by some of the same problems that are infecting the federal government. Now, I did do the channeling between March and July, August of 2020. So we know about the regime that was in power then. But his comments were beyond a particular administration. So I did not put Trump or Biden in there, or his views of those if he expressed them, because I want the book to be just as relevant 20 years from now as it is now.
Sure.
Because his thoughts are universal. The corruption that he sees in our government has been going on for a long time, not just recent administrations or the current administration. Any reading of history will show you that in the 1880s, Congress was almost totally corrupt and money was buying the presidency and so on. So the corruption has been around a good while. And so I give a talk on America's first leadership crisis, and I try to put a few jokes in there for the people. And I think that Jefferson would agree with Robin Williams when Robin Williams said congressmen should wear sponsor jackets like the NASCAR drivers so you can see who owns them. And he would agree with that. That the majority of people in Congress have been bought out by wealth and the need for power. He said that he does try to work with the new members of Congress who have not gotten corrupted by the system. And he says he whispers in their ear when he can to remind them of their oaths.
Wow.
But he said that, and I'll quote him, I said, one of my questions, I used questions from historians who thought they were participating in a class project rather than a metaphysical project. And so I'll tell you about some of their questions, but this was one of mine. I said, what is your greatest concern about American government today? And the answer was corruption, self-interest, and conformity. He said, our grand experiment as a democratic republic, a government by the people, for the people, of the people, has gone awry. And he said that we are seeing chaos now. There's going to be a purge. And he calls for a new revolution, but not of the bloody sort, he said, but a revolution of integrity. So he was very negative about what's going on in our government. And finally, I said, well, can't you say something positive? This is really depressing. And so he would interject at the end. I tried to end the chapters on a positive note that he did feel that the founding fathers had been, including himself, had been divinely inspired to put the system of freedom in place for the people. So unlike what our ancestors had had under kings and nobility and bad religion and so on. And freedom, in all of the readings that I had 9 readings, well, 8 full readings and then some partial readings, 8 full sessions with Thomas Jefferson. Freedom came through in all of those. And he was always the rebel and always for a little revolution. He knew that the powers of wealth and power would take over from time to time, and the people would need to rebel against that. But he's calling for a rebellion, of an ethical rebellion. It's time for people to wake up, to start thinking critically, and see what's going on, and with regard to the controlling forces. And start voting for ethical people.
Right. So a responsibility. So some type of ethics, which really start in our own culture and with the individual.
That's right. So at the end, he'd done all this criticism of everything that was going on. I said, well, I thought I'd put him on the spot. I said, well, what would you do if you were president of the United States, or if you were in Congress, or if you were president of the University of Virginia? We had some thoughts about UVA, the school that he founded, a few criticisms. And anyway, so he said that he would not come back as president because he could get very little done, because there'd be too much opposition to what he'd want to do. I think he does not approve of term limits, but he said they're almost necessary because of the corruption that's going on. But he'd want to propose things like term limits and some other. I think he'd want to just take the government down and start all over again, which would never happen. But so he said he wouldn't come back as running for president. He might come back as a congressman, but he would still have very little power by himself. Couldn't do much by himself because of all the other forces that were around that would not approve of the reforms that he would want to make. So he said the people in Congress or himself, if he were to come in, need to form circles of integrity. And they need to start with a small group of people who still have their integrity, hasn't been bought and sold. Mm-hmm. Their souls haven't gone to the system. And widen that circle of integrity so that you have enough people who can make the reforms that are necessary. And then he said, out of that circle of integrity, they would choose a leader as president, ideally. This is ideally speaking. And that leader, if he had enough people around him of goodwill, that they could affect the changes. But at present, the changes cannot be made with the way things are right now.
Okay. So what is he recommending? You explain that a little bit further. An integrity revolution. You said groups to get together, but what about the voters? I mean, there's a responsibility for the voters too, right?
Absolutely. He says what he craves most to see on this planet is critical thinking. That people are just buying into the party line. They're not thinking critically about what they're hearing and seeing in the media. And he said that the founding fathers, one of their fundamental rights in the Bill of Rights is the freedom of the press. And of course, that bit Jefferson in his day. There's a two-edged sword if you want freedom of the press. But he still, it's an ultimate freedom, a basic freedom that we should have. And he said that, and this is not news to anybody today, but he said that he had been watching as our media outlets have been bought up by special interests. And that special interests were trying to control the narrative. And there have been in the past, the investigative reporters, and what they would investigate would be front page news. And he said, extra, read all about it. But he said that there were an increasingly fewer number of investigative reporters who were rooting out the what did he call it? Rooting out the weeds. And that there were these big forces that were trying to control the narrative. And once again, I'll have to say that he is very current with current events, and he uses modern terminology in these sessions that I had. And I wrote everything down he said dutifully. I didn't make any of it up. And by the way, the medium hates history. She knew very little about Thomas Jefferson. So there are only three ways to look at my book. One is I wrote it. I have the recordings to prove that I was asking the questions. I wasn't providing the answers. Number two, the medium made everything up. Well, she hates history, and it's just not her thing. Knew very little about Thomas Jefferson. Had a hard time bringing through some of the words that he was using. Or number three, we're hearing from somebody on the other side who's presenting as Thomas Jefferson. So when he talks about the internet, he is very current about what's going on. Yeah. He said that the forces who have them, who are forces of greed and power, who don't have the people's best interests in mind. They have their own self-interest in mind, that they are trying to control the narrative, but that the internet has kind of gotten away from them. So that's the only thing they can't control totally.
Right.
They try to, but they can't, and it's bothering them.
It's bothering.
Did he
That
mention
is
anything
funny.
about censorship, about what gets free speech is very important and is part of things that he actually touch on that, or does he see that's going on these days, or?
He didn't mention the word censorship. He just said that there were these powerful forces that are trying to
Okay.
control the narrative,
Okay.
and that what he misses most on this planet is critical thinking.
Okay.
And we all have friends who listen to certain news outlets, and they swallow it hook, line, and sinker, and they're the ones who are right, and everybody else is wrong, and there's no critical thinking there, and there's a lot of that going on right now.
Well, what happened to asking questions? I remember coming in this world as a child, why this, why that? And then I get an answer, why that too? And so, I guess this is what you mean by critical thinking. I said, well, why is that? Why are they saying that? Or is this true? Let me see the paperwork. Where's the facts? So it's really digging and also doing your own homework too, don't you think?
Exactly. Yeah. Don't take the easy way out, but do some homework, do some fact checking, check other points of view, come up with your own mind on something important.
Right.
Like,
So this to me, I mean, we live here. So I mean, this is things that we've seen a lot of polarization, and because people get into a whatever narrative they are, and then they assume that it's correct without questioning that, questioning really quite honestly everything. And so, did he explain what is it going to take for people to get out of this? It's like a record repeating itself. This horrible, this merry-go-round of this to just snap out of that and think for themselves, because obviously he came from a time where that did have to happen.
yes, yes. He came from a time when people had more time to think and took more time to think.
Mm.
And one of his criticisms of higher education, then there's a chapter on higher education, was that a lot of our colleges now are just job factories. People go to train for a job, nothing wrong with that. But but they're not, and I'm adding to this. This is not exactly what he said, but under his mentor George Wythe, he studied Plato and Aristotle and John Locke. He studied those people, the founding fathers. They studied philosophy,
Yeah.
the best ideas of the best people through the generations. Well, nobody takes philosophy anymore. They think it's just a soft subject and not important. It is important because it helps us to think
Everything.
critically about things. And so that's a big difference now between our education and the education that our founding fathers had. They were taught to think, and they were taught to think critically as well. And they talked about ideas. They didn't have TV, or, obviously they didn't have cell phones to occupy themselves all the time. And they would sit around the fireplace at night and have a drink, and they would talk about ideas. They would talk about what constitutes a good government. What is the best government for the people? Should we have a king again, or should we have a president? Should we have one house, or should we have two houses? What kind of court system are we going to have to best serve the people? They work through all of that. And one thing Jefferson said in the book was that don't think this was easy. He said subjects like, or freedoms like religious freedom. And I know for a fact here in Virginia, that was a huge fight to even get the first bill allowing people to have religious freedom. There's a long chapter in my first book on that. You would think it would be a given, but it wasn't, because the people in control wanted everybody to go to their church, which was the Church of England, and pay taxes for that church.
Wow.
And their beliefs were the correct beliefs. And
Right.
Baptists, Presbyterians, and others were second-class citizens, and they were treated as second-class citizens in Virginia, which is probably a good thing because it made those people really mad. They had fought in the American Revolution for freedom from England, and then they came back to Virginia, and the people were lording it over them regarding their own religious freedom. And so there was a big fight here in Richmond, where I live, in 1786 about the bill that Thomas Jefferson wrote, the first religious freedom bill in America that 5 years later became embedded in the First Amendment to the Constitution. He wrote that in concert with the man I wrote about, George Wythe, although George Wythe didn't get any credit for it because he didn't write the final draft, but it was a partnership. And so yeah, it was really hard they were going against the establishment even then. And here in Virginia was kind of a microcosm. We had the big plantation owners, the big slave owners, who had become very, very wealthy here, and they had taken positions of authority in the state government. And they began to think of themselves as lords of the land, kind of like the House of Lords in England.
Yeah.
And that everybody else was a commoner and not entitled to the same representation in the legislature. And that really galled, the reformers like Wythe and Jefferson and Madison and the others. And so they worked really hard to extend voting rights to more people. And so freedom, 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 that is what comes through in this book and what came through in everything that Jefferson did, of course, except for freeing the slaves, which is another subject. But
Yeah. So, did that come up?
oh, yes.
Did it really?
Oh, I have a whole
Gosh.
chapter on that in both
Oh,
books. There's a long chapter on it in the first book, um, explaining the origins of the institution. And my man that I wrote about, George Wythe, was completely out of step with his peers. He was an abolitionist from his Quaker heritage, and he did free his slaves. And as a judge, he was the first and only judge that I know of to rule slavery illegal based on Virginia's Bill of Rights, that all men are inherently born free. He actually freed a woman on that, but and her 2 children.
wow, that's beautiful.
But actually, they were not freed on that count. They were freed on another count. That count was overturned because slavery was the law of the land.
Which that was revolutionary back then.
Mm-hmm.
I
Right.
mean, a lot of people wanted that to stay in place
Mm-hmm.
for their own benefit and their own greed. So, does he talk about? So does Jefferson himself talk about slavery, and
Yes.
in terms of it now, or
Yes.
only in the past? Okay, because I was curious if he talked about slavery, because we're really kind of enslaving ourselves if we don't think for ourselves.
Yes. He believes that we are enslaved now. We don't recognize it because it's sort of like the frog that was put in the cold
Yeah,
water and
turned
eventually it boils
turned
and
up.
can't get up.
You're like,
But
wait a minute, this is kind of
yeah,
hot in here.
right. He says we've gradually lost a lot of our freedom.
Okay.
Yes, I had to have a chapter on slavery because Jefferson's being called to terms right now because he did not free his slaves. What people don't realize is that when he was a young man under the influence of George Wythe, who was an abolitionist, he proposed laws to end slavery gradually and educate the people of color, make them good citizens, and and then some of his students formed a society to give them their own homeland.
Mhm.
As Jefferson always spent more than he made, I think he really tried to be a good farmer. He had a lot of innovative techniques. He thought about growing silkworms and all kinds of things that didn't work out. He lived well. He spent beyond his means. He also gave loans. He had bad loans out. He had a lot of financial troubles in his last 20 years. He died a poor man. People don't realize that.
Really?
Weather conditions affecting his crops and so on. The slaves were his only collateral. I'm not defending slavery. He should have freed his slaves.
Right.
But he said that it had become increasingly difficult for him to do that. And in his last 20 years, he was very busy with his great vision for this great university, and that he focused all of his energies on that. He said in the reading that he always considered himself a kindly master, and that he did sincerely think the slaves were better off under him than going out in the cold, cruel world. And it was a cold, cruel world for freed slaves too. They could be snatched off the street anytime and sold down to the cotton fields in the South. Also, Virginia passed some very bad laws for freed slaves because they didn't want them around because they thought they were a bad influence on the slaves. And so if you were a freed slave, you had to leave everyone you loved here in Virginia and go to another state. And so in his own mind, he conjured up the idea that they were better off under him, that he would take care of them. He said he realizes now, the flaw in his thinking, that he was a man of his time. He thought on that count, he thought like everybody else, except George Wythe and a few others. They all had the same idea of hierarchy of color, but also hierarchy of males over females. And this was something that really surprised me in the readings. He would speak about the disenfranchisement of women as well as people of color. Of course, people of color had it a lot worse, but how women were discounted for having
Right.
much intellectual weight. And he said he had to, when the University of Virginia opened up to people of color as well as women, he had a hard time with that, which I thought was interesting because he still had some of those 18th century thoughts apparently with him, even though he had all these other grand thoughts as well. But that he had to come to terms with his deeply ingrained feelings of hierarchy, and women as well as people of color. And so I said, well, aren't you happy for people of color now that can go to your university? And he said, yes, that he was very happy that, he said, patting myself on my own back, I can say I've come to terms with all that, but it took me a while to do so.
Wow, that's his spiritual growth. He had to, from his time, handle that. That's interesting. I remember going to Williamsburg and looking at one of the churches. I was on a tour, and they had all the men sit below, and the slaves upstairs with the women. Women
Yeah.
sat upstairs. So women had a low status and could actually, by law, be beat with a stick by their husband. So it wasn't you were owned property if you were a female. Is that true? You're the historian, but that's how I understand it to be.
Women's opinions were not taken seriously. Women were to sew and play a piano or play some instrument and take care of the children and run the household. And they were not expected to have great ideas about government or anything of a higher nature. And this is one of the interesting things that came through. This is going to get really weird. Hang on.
No,
So
no.
I spent I don't know, hundreds, maybe thousands of hours on this first book. It's a pretty big book, the George Wythe biography called Jefferson's Godfather. And so after a while, I said, why am I spending all this time on this? He was a great man, and I like to write. I love to write. It's good history. It's a great story to tell. But why do I have some kind of connection with this person?
Okay.
So I asked my medium Jana Anna, I was working with her to talk to my late husband and my mother and father and some other people. So I said, have you ever channeled historic figures? And she said she had. And I said, well, I want to talk to George Wythe because I'm writing this book about him. So she brought him in, and I said, how do you like my book? And he said, our book. He said, I'm helping you with it.
Oh, you weren't done. That's why you were so focused on it, because he wasn't done saying what he was going to say.
That's true. And
Mm.
when he'd been apparently helping, he put the idea in my head, I guess, I don't know. well, that sequence of events. And so I said, well, how do I know you? I feel like, we must have known each other. I mean, why am I so interested in you? And he said, well, we did have a life together in Williamsburg. And the medium said that it was sort of like a brotherly, sisterly relationship. But maybe there was a little spice to it. Maybe we kind of liked each other, but of course we didn't do anything about it. But so I'm guessing maybe I was his sister-in-law because his wife's sister-in-law, because he was very, very fond of his wife's brother and used to spend a lot of time with them. So anyway, the story that came out was that I lived in Williamsburg, that I had married up, that I started out not in the upper echelon, but I had married up because I was smart and beautiful. Anyway, so he used to come over to our house for tea or rum or whatever, brandy, and we would talk about current events. And he said that he really liked my ideas, that I had given him some of his best ideas, but that he could never give me credit for it because I was a woman.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
And then the medium said that there was a figure, I think it was me, who dressed like a man sometimes so she could hang around where the men were talking about government and revolution and so on, but they wouldn't allow her in. But her ideas were as good as theirs, or sometimes better, and that really galled me. So if this is true, I mean, who knows if this is true, but anyway, I'm just telling you what I heard.
Yeah.
Then the reason I'm writing the book is I'm writing about some of my own ideas.
That is wonderful. I love that. How magical is that?
Yeah,
So that's funny. So you would dress up in attractive and you just wouldn't fix up or put a little rouge on. You just kind of tucked your hair in a hat and pretended to be one of a young fella there with your opinions
I
listening
guess.
in.
Yeah.
Isn't that funny? Boy, that's gutsy. Kind of like right now what you're doing is gutsy.
Mhm.
So, wow. That is cool. Did you run any past life? I know you said you've had past life. Did you run any past life where you came across Jefferson too?
No, I asked him about that. He said that our paths had crossed in the past, but I didn't really get any definite information on that. I mean, we weren't brother or sister or married or mother, father, anything like that. I guess it was more,
Friendship.
I don't know. I don't know, but I do have an affinity toward Jefferson.
Yeah. I mean, this isn't definitely a mistake. Um, uh, I mean, when I first contacted you, I was like, this is an amazing story. It's got to be told. I heard the word confidant,
Yeah, I could have been.
confidant, and
Mhm.
hey, having good friends, they don't grow on trees. Someone you can
That's right.
truly trust that has your back. Even if you think about now, like how many people can you count? One, two, I don't know, not a lot. So I think that you don't have to always be married to someone. It could be that
Right.
someone that you truly trust really
Mhm.
matters. Friendship, true, really good friendships do matter. So, and of course, you wouldn't just trust anyone with your life's work and to be able to give a
Mhm.
message. So that
Right.
it's amazing how the universe, God, source can put all this together. This whole scenario together, and it's so orchestrated so perfectly. It's fascinating. So,
Mhm.
what does he say right now about the Declaration? Because I know I'm asking you to paraphrase. You've got to buy the book, The Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson, and to see all the detail. But the Declaration of Independence, that's sort of that's not really exactly being followed right now. Do you
Mhm.
think it's people's ignorance because people have grown lazy? Did he
Yeah,
talk about their laziness? How lazy
yeah,
people are lazy? Don't you think they're lazy? I think they're very lazy.
yeah.
I'm like, look, don't believe. Do your own research. Ask questions. Do your own little research and so forth. But they're they they're lazy. Did he
Yeah.
talk about this?
He didn't use the word lazy, but We all know that most people spend their time either on the TV or on their cell phones when they're not talking with other
Or
people.
social media, looking at
Social
dog
media, right,
pictures or kitty cat pictures.
right. And so it takes some self-discipline to sit down and actually pull out the Declaration of Independence and read it, or the
Mhm.
Constitution. It takes a little bit of self-discipline to actually, and patience to actually do that. Now, the only opportunity we have is in school, and I think there's some thought that the schools are not paying enough attention to the founding ideas of this country as much as they should. My own opinion is that yes, they were flawed individuals, and yes, some of them were slave owners, but you can't throw everything out on that one fatal flaw that they had, bad flaw that they had, that they
And
founded. It was so different what they came up with for us. And people need to read a little medieval history. They need to read the history of Europe, how corrupt things were, how awful our ancestors had things under the heels of the nobility and the bad religious people who had become corrupt. Um, what they came up with was marvelous. It was wonderful. The freedoms that were given to us.
so the Declaration of Independence, is that something that you're a historian, that you've studied in depth yourself?
To tell you the truth, I haven't,
That's
but I
okay.
need to go back and do it.
That's
Yeah,
okay.
I did actually. I did when I was writing the With book. I did. There's a whole chapter on the Declaration of Independence, and it's in two parts. The first part is very noble. That was written by Thomas Jefferson, uh, and reflecting the philosophy of John Locke and some of the other Enlightenment philosophers about all men are created equal, and we are entitled to our freedoms of government and entitled to overthrow corrupt government. And then the second part is what the Declaration of Independence was designed to be was a legal brief before the court of world opinion. Here we were, this upstart, rude, rough little nation going up against the greatest power in the Western world. And we had to have a case for that because all of the European powers had colonies or were going after colonies. They felt that it was their privilege, their right to be the rulers of the rest of the world. Certainly England did. And so the second part of the Declaration, the man I wrote about, George Wythe, had a big role in organizing that. And that was the list of grievances against King George, all the atrocities that the British troops were committing up and down the East Coast. But yes, the first part, the preamble, is a very noble piece of work. And it does reflect a lot of Enlightenment philosophy that we should be reading ourselves. Fortunately, I was required to have a class in philosophy for my master's degree. And it was probably the best class I've ever had in my life.
Wow, that says a lot. My husband's always studied philosophy, and he said the basis of all the politics, if you look at the philosophy, I can tell you the politics. And I'm like, wow, really? And it's your it's your position on how you think and so forth. A lot of people don't realize that and where they're coming from. But yeah, you're right. I think it's laziness and it's turning off the stuff. Did Thomas Jefferson talk about distractions? Because I find there's so many distractions in this day and time that they didn't have back then, where they were able to have time to sit down and talk, or whether it be at dinner time or wherever it may be, in a sitting room where they could have a discussion. Very rarely do you see people sitting in a room together unless they're being entertained by a game or TV or something, and or even at the very least music, but just in silence and having a conversation. Did he speak about this is quite a big change this day and time? Did he talk about that?
Yeah, he said in his day they called it contemplation. He said
Oh, okay.
that's what they called it in his day. And what he did was he would go out and commune with nature. He was on his horse quite a lot, when he lost his wife or when something really bad happened, he would get on his horse and he would go over the fields and through the woods and so on. And he would try to connect with nature and with the higher power. And he said, so in his day, they called it contemplation.
Okay.
He said, in our day, we call it meditation. And that is quieting the mind and calming ourselves from all of the distractions and the irritations that we're constantly bombarded with.
Wow, that is very insightful. It's very similar to what people are trying to go back to now, meditating in nature, stilling the mind, which is still critical. So you so you can see things clearly and make better decisions versus having a bunch of noise about you. So, wow. Now, how did this change you spiritually? Because here you are, trained as a historian. Now this world of the spirit world is being open to you. And then just for you to be open to experience and go through this and say, hey, maybe, let's see, says a lot about you. What did you, as a person spiritually, how did it affect you? What are ways that you've seen yourself change because of it?
Well, I try to be open to spiritual things, and I go online a lot. I listen to testimonials. I read books. After my husband died, I really got into near-death experience testimonials, the individual books and the summaries of accounts, and then that led to Many Lives, Many Masters, Reincarnation. That led to Life Between Lives by Michael Newton. And I listen to that sometimes at night to go to sleep. I listen to Life Between Lives,
Yeah.
Journey of Souls. I listen to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I listen to, when I can't sleep, I listen to a lot of spiritual things. I just try to stay open. The Jefferson book just seemed to evolve. It just seemed to be the next thing that I was going to do, you know. I said, oh, I guess that's what I should be doing. Well, okay, I'll just make an appointment with a medium and we'll get started and see what happens.
So they were pushing you, right? Don't you think the other side was pushing you?
I have felt guided, yeah,
Mhm.
but gently, not in any big way, just gently guided. And fortunately, I am retired. I get to decide what to do with my time. Right now, I'm a little too busy with club work to get back to my next book, but I need to shed some of these little duties that I have and get back to writing.
No, I
Um,
understand.
yeah, but I feel that I have been gently guided, and it's never like a burning bush. It's never anything terribly exciting. Just what I do.
Now, after you compiled all the information in the book, do you feel that Thomas Jefferson maybe is communicating with you through your dreams, or do you feel him around? Because he knows you studied him, you're interested in him. He's
Yeah,
obviously talked to you, so it's kind of like an old friend now. I mean, did he just disappear? I find that hard to believe.
I did. I had a session with the medium recently because a friend died, and I wanted to talk to her. And so at the end, I did ask for Thomas Jefferson, and he did tell me that he was pleased with the work, and he told me that he enjoys watching people read it. Watching the ideas that go through their minds. The fresh thoughts that might come from that book. That he was enjoying that process. And I said, well, you need to get on the stick because we're not selling enough of these books. I said, get out there and sell.
Oh my gosh. Well, he was quite now wasn't and when he was walking this world, I mean, he was quite a spokesperson, and I mean, he had quite a charisma, right?
Yes.
Because he spoke in public, and it wasn't like we had, YouTube, or we had these different platforms or TV. He had to actually stand in a room full of people and project his voice, and he had to be persuasive. So honestly, he could probably help with promotion too. I'm serious.
Yeah.
Why not?
Well, actually, Jefferson was not a good speaker.
Oh, really? Okay.
He was in awe of Patrick Henry, who was the great orator. But they were as different as night and day. Patrick Henry was not a scholar. Jefferson was a scholar. Patrick Henry, I think he might have been dyslexic. I'm not sure. He never read books. And my man, George Wythe, almost didn't grant him his law license when he was on a commission to grant licenses. Anyway, so Jefferson had a weak voice from what I have read, and he did not project well, but his pen was mighty. He spoke through his pen.
Okay.
And his letters and the reports that he wrote are wonderful. And of course, his quotations are all over the place. And he would say, he did say in the book, in the metaphysical book, that he had a struggle between his mind and his heart. That, you know, he was thinking that his mind was coming up with all these beautiful words and beautiful ideals and concepts for freedom and government and so on. But he said he had to try to allow a lot of that to come through his heart. And so it was a constant juxtaposition between heart and mind, and that we should allow more of our heart to come through.
Oh, that's powerful.
And our leaders should allow more of their heart to come through.
Wow, if they still have heart left. Right? But that's and really that's true for everybody. I mean, your heart to me is your heart doesn't lie. Your heart knows the truth. Your heart wants what the heart wants. It has that discernment, and it's also, I believe, our connection to what we consider God. And so if we follow our heart, not our emotions, but our heart, it's just always right. So getting back to that heart source is so important. So look, this is such a beautiful job. I want to see more. So, you know, you remember, I don't know if you've ever been to like Disney World where I don't even know if they have it anymore, but a long time ago, they had this presidential thing and all the presidents would pop up and they'd come out in a wax figure and they would talk. This is like your books. You could just go right down the line and have, I mean, we could have, you know, we could have all sorts, Truman, this and that. I mean, have you thought about, or are you just waiting to see what spirit tells you your next big push is with, I know the book, you're still pushing this, but do you think there'll be more of this kind of work ahead?
I don't know. You know, there are a lot of writers who want to just grind out a book every year, you know, and I'm not one of those. I need to wait to be inspired to write something. And like, I don't write stories. I'm not a good fiction writer. I stick as closely as I can to nonfiction, the truth, you know. But yeah, somebody said, well, why don't you try to channel Abraham Lincoln?
Right.
And I said, well, I know a lot about the Civil War. I don't really want to know any more about it. I know enough. And that's not where my heart is.
Yeah, terrible time.
My heart is with the founding of this country. And so the book I'm working on now, it's a straight history book, although I might get some inspiration for it. But it's called America's First Leadership Crisis. And it's about our lack of qualified ethical leaders in the beginning of this country, except for a handful of founding fathers. If you can see, there were fewer founding fathers than these two hands, depending on who's describing, who's naming the founding fathers. Fewer than a dozen, let's put it that way, depending on who's counting. And the rest of the country, most of the people were pretty ignorant. Very few people had a college education, and many were illiterate. When they went to the polls, everybody was drunk and fed rum and ribs to vote properly or vote for whoever.
Rum and ribs.
Yes.
That sounds like quite a scene. So you're painting a picture, and this is perfect because I was going to ask you, what was the picture like back then? Because it must have been unruly during his time period.
Yeah. Yeah, very. So we were, you know, we were definitely looked down upon by the elites in Europe. They thought we were just an ignorant rabble run amok, and we could never operate a government by ourselves without a king and parliament. They were waiting, particularly England was smarting from losing the colonies. and they were waiting for us to fail. They couldn't wait for us to fail so they could come back in. And they didn't think we were capable of self-government. They didn't know what self-government was. It was so different from the way Europe had been run. Well, most of the world had been run. So we did a wonderful thing when we created a democratic republic that was the model for the rest of the world.
Yes. Which is what he's saying we need to get back to. We need to look back at these things and question and like you said, he was such a rebel in his time. He would probably want to start over, but that's probably unlikely. But the fact that he is watching intently and even watching the people read his book that he helped you write, that's
Right.
amazing, and delighted by it.
Yeah.
Right, which makes you now, that's how it works. I mean, if you're listening to, if you love a particular musician and you love listening to their music, like Elvis, well, guess who knows you're listening to their music?
Right.
I mean,
In terms of future books, there is a colonial woman that I'm really interested in, and I never knew why, because there's so little known about her. I had the title for the book and very little else, but the title of the book is The Richest Woman in America, because she was married to the richest man in America at one point. And then in a session with the medium, I found out, that I did have a connection with her. And I don't know how to write that book. I don't know whether it'll be written or not, but she has a story.
oh, wow.
So,
Well, it'll evolve. And I think this is a good example. I mean, there were so many things just in your story about how all this is manifested. If people just trusted the process that God, the universe, source, they got your back, just follow your next little nudge, your next little thing that you feel inclined to do, and follow that. And you don't have to worry about how it's all going to work out in the end, because it's all going to work out nicely. Like, who would have thought that you would have come this far and written this book, and now this information is out there, and just for people to know this is possible, even if they think, yeah, there's no way, there's a part of them that does think it's a way. They
yeah.
might not even admit it, but uh, I have seen too many things by now, and it's how does it all work? I don't know, but they are watching and listening to us. Someone said, "Are we like little TV channels?" Sorta. I don't know. Yeah,
Yeah.
they tap into our energy, and they know when their name comes up, or something that's that connection is like the spiritual web, and
Right.
then they're connected to us, and they know. So, there's more to come from you for sure. They know that you're a willing vessel, and that you're also a beautiful writer, and so they're delighted to work with you. I'm sure they're going to continue on, but you have been a joy, and also Anna, our first part one, she was a joy. But the work that you're doing is just phenomenal, and that you're taking your history and you're making it come to life.
If I may say something before we conclude, I am a seeker, as you are, and I was very interested in Jefferson's views about God and Jesus and religion.
Oh, I would love to hear that. Yes,
Right.
yes.
So there is a chapter on religion in the Metaphysical Jefferson book.
Oh,
And
fantastic.
as with all the other chapters, I start out with what I know about the historic Jefferson. And I knew that he had written what's called the Jefferson Bible. It's the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth or something. And what he did was this is toward the end of his life, he took the 4 Gospels and he did a cut and paste job, and he studied them in different languages. And he left out things that he thought were written by individuals rather than being divinely inspired.
Got it.
He took out miracles because he was kind of a materialist, although he said in these recent readings that miracles do happen.
Mhm.
But he wanted people to feel more power themselves, that they could do some of these things, miracles that Jesus had done.
Yes.
And we're seeing that, I think, in some miraculous healing that is taking place here and there.
Absolutely.
But anyway, so he said that Jesus had left most churches, many churches today, that he had withdrawn his spirit from organized religion. Now, we all know churches that do adhere to love and generosity and forgiveness. So
Of course.
it's not all bad, but we also know that. So I think some of his words were, Jesus has withdrawn his energy from those organizations that specialize in exclusion, hate, division, judgment, money, and power. And he's not present in those institutions.
Wow.
But he said that, I think the term that I've been hearing recently is the Christ energy. And so I'll use that term. The Christ energy is present. He said the name of Jesus does have power, that you can call on him,
Yeah.
and that he does exist. And so then I said, what about God? And he said, well, God is like energy, it's fuel, and the basis of everything there is.
Life.
Yeah, life. God is life. Yeah.
Yeah. And love. Wow. Does he talk about encountering Jesus in the spirit realms or at any of this as well?
We didn't get into that.
Oh, well, you might have to pick that up.
Yeah.
That might be cool to do the whole nature of spirit and so forth, and who's around him and what kind of conversations does he have there. I know that there was one of the courses I took in mediumship. That's what we did for a week. We talked about what they did on the other side in heaven. And there's art and there's music and there's all sorts of things. So why wouldn't it be, right? On heaven and
That's
earth.
right. Yeah.
So this life goes on. So, if you think you're going to rest when this life is over, wrong, you're going to be put to some kind of job or do something, because it's a continuation. It's just at a higher vibration
That's right.
than here naturally. But that's beautiful that you shared that about Christ. And I see that so much with people, and it makes me sad for them that they create division uh, uh, amongst each other when Jesus loves everybody. He doesn't care if someone knows him, doesn't know him, can't stand him. Uh, he doesn't care about what church or no church, or he's just not that way. He's just pure love. So when people start getting into their own specific thing, it unfortunately sometimes turns people off, because it's not. I think it's because they know innately that's not who Jesus is. Jesus loves everybody.
Right.
It's just that simple. Well, gosh, this has been so amazing. Everybody buy the Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson, and as well, let me put both your books here. You do have both. And again, you said you did get some of the channeling from the first one as well as you were ending off the Jefferson's godfather. I want to say grandfather, but godfather, the man behind the man. And then you also have, of course, the Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson, which answers a lot of these questions that we did not get to go over all of them, but you can read through it. And this is just a fascinating journey. And then you can know a little bit about the medium in part 1 too. She does talk about her mediumship and about how this developed and the fact she was open, and this is something new for her. Check out the first part as well as part 2. Thank you so much for your time, Suzanne. You are really a blessing and courageous and a trailblazer. And you are really at the forefront of this love revolution. So I thank you. I know that Thomas Jefferson is super proud of you. So thank you so much for holding the torch for all of us to open our eyes to this world is so much more than we can imagine, and we're all part of the past and the future and the present. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I have thoroughly enjoyed our session. Thank you so much.
Oh, you are so welcome.